What I'd like to present to you today is a very interesting topic, and hopefully we'll go with more serious than that. The topic is about how to avoid some of the most common and yet unpleasant kind of traps that happen quite common in games between beginner and sometimes even intermediate players. You see, the problem with many of these traps is that they're often not really described in books. I mean, some of them are written in beginners' books, but it's hard to find them. Others aren't really even mentioned because most of them happen out of the imagination of your opponent's, ideas on how to play the opening. It's not book-line. Yet they happen, and when we meet them, it really turns out a bit difficult to play against those. So my idea will be to cover some of the most common of these so that when they happen, you know how to react to them, how to defend, and what to do so that you really don't get in trouble and actually develop a decent position. Now, what we're going to begin with is one line that is called the 4-move checkmate. I mean, the 4-move checkmate is very tricky, I have to say, and that often happens on a real beginner level. We're talking about 1,000 to 1,100, so it really happens, and many kids really like to play. That's why I believe on many occasions it's actually called the scholar's maid. I mean, we have the scholar's maid. There are different deviations, obviously, in how it can go. But how do you defend it, and what do you do so that you make sure there is no trouble there when your opponent tries it? Okay, so basically, one of the most common lines that I've seen in games of my students and so happens after e4 when black goes with e5 and ultimately white plays the move queen to h5. So this is tricky because when he actually plays the queen on the h5 and he attacks the pawn on e5, people really don't know what to do. So, I mean, usually the move that they choose to do is to protect it with knight c6. Now, here's what happens a lot of times in games played between beginner players. White just develops his bishop on c4. In seeing this queen so early develop in the middle of the board, black simply decides, hey, you know what? Let's get rid of it. Let's attack it, and maybe our knight is attacking the queen, and at the same time it's attacking the pawn. So this really looks good. And what we suddenly realize is that after knight f6, white can actually capture on the f7. Now, to tell you the truth, many people don't realize that checkmating possibility until it actually happens, and then it's too late, you see. Because when it comes, black's king is practically checkmated. And you see, when I was younger, I remember that one of the first things that my dad, who was a national master level, used to teach me was this one. And interestingly enough, he taught me 2 ways how I can deal with it, actually. The first way he taught me on how to deal and really reduce the, any of the threats that the queen can make in a safe manner. And the second way that he told me was about how to punish white for really making such a move. Now, let me clarify what punish means. See, punishing means that when your opponent develops his queen so early on in the game, and that's basically wrong, because, you see, to bring out the queen too early, we need to have a very good reason, or we need to have a chance to win a lot of material. Otherwise, this queen can hit very easily into a big target. And when black gets to attack on it, not only does he win a lot of time, but it will be more than enough to get a huge advantage. So, here's, first of all, the solid way to deal with queen h5 and bishop c4. The solid way to do it is first you need to protect your pawn on the e5, just as it is. So we make sure it's defended by our knight, okay? And when the white bishop comes out to c4, so now he's ultimately making the threat against f7 with both his queen and the bishop, we should block the most important piece, the queen. Now, you probably know that in most of my lectures, I really like to involve concepts behind the moves, because you see, the unfortunate thing about the move, or a position, or even a variation is that you forget it. I mean, everybody forgets the line. But the important is that you remember the concept. You see, the concept is the one thing that makes most impression, and it stays. So the idea is that whenever you see, at any point in the game, not only in the opening, but whenever you see your opponent moving with a piece inside your territory, now that is a danger. Now you may say you can't do anything with that piece for the moment, but believe me, soon or later, it will do something. So basically, it's like leaving it to stay there inside your territory means to walk on a very thin ice, and that was really not good because you don't know when and where it is going to crack. So the plan is that we just neutralize the queen by playing g6, and ultimately if white plays queen f3, now the queen is less active. It still attacks on f7, So the most valuable is to really cut off the strongest piece. And basically when we do that, we resolve most of the immediate problems. You see, because if we deal with the bishop, then the queen will still remain there and it can still cause the trouble. So we have to deal with that piece, and later on, when it appears that he plays d3 or something, we can easily deal with the bishop. Sometimes you don't really have to deal with the supporter, just the major piece. So now white has to continue with queen b3 and hold the pressure on f7 to go on with his attack. So what do we do if white now tries to make the battery and attacks on f7 with both his queen and the bishop? Well, here comes the idea about punishing white. See, punishing is really not easy, and let me teach you a pattern that you have to recognize. When your opponent starts an early diversion, now diversion in chess is a term for starting an early and premature attack. So when he starts an early diversion, what you have to do is think about two ideas specifically. The first idea is to ask yourself, what are his threats? And as much as you can, try to block them in the fastest way possible. So basically, we find out a threat and would like to block it. Okay. Second idea that we have to think about is, how do I really attack against his weaknesses? Because any early diversion like that creates weaknesses. And the most interesting about both of these is that sometimes actually you can block the attack and essentially try to exploit his weaknesses at the same time. Just exactly what you can do right now. After queen b3 attacks on f7, and many of you will say, okay, well, let's bring the queen up. Sounds like it's protecting the pawn. We can bring out the bishop, we can castle, and that's all good. The thing is, however, that after queen to b3, black can do knight d4. And the trick here is that if the white bishop really captures, bishop takes f7, when the king moves e7, we realize that winning one pawn was actually the end of all white's attack. Why is that so? It's because now his queen is attacked, his bishop is hanging, and the c2 pawn is under pressure. So ultimately what comes is that when the queen moves anywhere, let's say c4, trying to protect both weak squares on the c2 and f7 at the same time, we can drive the queen out and ultimately collect the bishop. And that is really bad for him. I mean, you can realize that white just lost a piece, and well, he won a pawn, he weakened our king, but I really don't believe that he can do anything. I mean, look at white's development. All his pieces are in the back rank now. I really don't think that it will be less than at least 5 to 6 moves until he brings those pieces and gets ready to do something. So it's quite interesting, but is this the only way we can deal with that? Well, guess what? There is another way too. If your opponent does queen h5 and you want to really take advantage of this in the fastest way possible, the second thing that my dad used to teach me when I was younger was that actually I can play it in a gambit way. You see, often when your opponent chooses an early attack like this, he really delays his development, and he's hoping that maybe he will not know how to defend it, so that essentially his strategy could prove successful. However, sometimes you may not actually need to defend it. I mean, okay, well, if it's checkmating, you need to defend it. But if it's a pawn or something, if it's a small material, you can even give it up. Why? Because when you give it away, you will get enough time to even advance with your development more. And actually, you will be much more developed than your opponent. Yes, but, okay, you'll say, I'll be more developed, but what about the pawn? I mean, or the piece which he's going to take? I mean, he'll also get to develop maybe a bit later, and that extra material will prove significant. It's not quite like that, because you see, if you have a better and faster development than your opponent, you can start attacking him. And when you attack him, you make him defend instead of develop. So ultimately, the second very smart way to deal with it is to play knight f6. Should his queen take on e5, we can have the opportunity to play bishop e7. And then if white plays like the move of knight c3, we could actually go with short castles. Now, many players will feel like, okay, I really don't feel so good about playing this position. I mean, let's have a look. I have a pawn down, I have no threats. And really, I'd prefer the g6 line. It sounds better and solid. Yes, but you see, this is just now. Remember that black's pieces are just developing, and he can gain a lot more time. Take a look at this. After d3, we can set our rook directly against the white queen, and we're prepared to move our bishop. Now, if this bishop moves somewhere, like, I don't know, b4 and any other moves, We could also break through with d5, and white's king, as well as most of his pieces from behind, are really bad. What's amazing is that after queen to g3, let's say, then we've got d5 on the line. Then maybe white will try to develop and speed up his pieces so that he can, I don't know, ultimately try and do something better. We can even do moves like actually d4, and we realize how bad the white position is. Now, why is that so? Well, it is because now we have a very cool idea on how we can trap down the queen. Have a look at that. All the squares of the white queen are essentially taken. So we have these squares taken, we have these squares taken, any other square is taken except of e5. And when it just goes there, remember that little pattern that we often see when we go in tactics? It's called a discovered attack. So what we can do is give a check against the white king, and now we discover an attack against this queen. So in the beginning, it always looks safe when there are no immediate threats. But the truth is that the development that one gets is more than enough as an advantage and compensation, as some people call it, for the sacrifice. So if you really want to be more aggressive and prove your opponent's early diversion, this means premature attack being wrong, give away that pawn, develop your pieces, and quickly open the position. Once you do that, you'll find out how his development wouldn't really matter, and I mean, he won't have the development. Actually, your development will matter, his development will not, and essentially that extra pawn he will never get to live in order to see it being successful or significant. So that is how you can deal with the four-moves checkmate, or scholar's mate, as some people call it. Now, basically, of course, there are some people saying, well, can't we just do it with bishop to c4 and then prepare for queen h5? Well, in that case, one idea that I'd like to tell you so that you really get away from any trouble is to play with knight f6. You see, knight f6 is pretty important because once we do it, we make sure that the queen cannot arrive at h5 and he can't make threats. So that's pretty important. Okay, now, since we've done this scholar's mate or the four checkmate, I mean, what we'd like to talk about is another thing that happens so regularly in the games between intermediate players. Now, people, or actually beginner players first, and sometimes even between intermediate players, basically, very often, in openings, let's say, white chooses to play, okay, bishop c4, knight f6, and then he develops with knight f3. So essentially, people don't know what to do, and then they go with the move of d6, actually, which is fine. I mean, it looks like it's developing. And then the opponent does a move like knight g5, and it really starts being ugly. f7 is being attacked 2 times. We don't have a chance to defend it with a good piece. I mean, we can protect it with the queen, but then when he takes it, we can't really take with the queen there, right? We know that the queen is 9 points, so giving it away for a bishop and then eventually a knight, that's just, 3 plus 3, 6. And not to mention that the queen is not only 9 points, but it's a much stronger piece than 2 pieces. So what we find out is that it's very dangerous and really bad. So what do we have to do in such a position? Well, in such a position, you can do 2 things. First, you can just play with a move like knight c6. And as I'm going to cover in another video, should white do knight g5, we have the chance to block that threat against f7. Remember that the f7 is called the Achilles heel. Now, you know the story about Achilles, who was a great warrior, and he had only one weak spot, so it was his heel, and that's where we held the Achilles heel in the black position. The only weakest spot that he has is the f7 pawn. So literally, we can't cover it in a very fast way, but we can prepare ourselves to defend it if he tries to attack it at an early stage. And so after d5, I'm going to show later on how black can defend, but the major idea is, for example, we can even drive that bishop away, and ultimately, he's no longer attacking on f7. Okay, but here's another question. What will happen if our pawn is smart enough and he plays knight c3, developing his knight, protecting the pawn in the middle, and especially the d5 square, and then he still goes with knight g5 as a threat. In this case, if we do d6, he's going to do knight g5, he's going to hit it on f7, and, well, let's face it, it's a bit unpleasant. So, actually, that doesn't look good. But here's what you can do. Don't worry at all about this. Your way to defend it in the easiest way possible is just to bring out the bishop. You can even follow the symmetry. It's okay to follow it for a certain time. If he now is attacking on f7 like this, you can very nicely castle short. In this particular occasion, should white get to take, you have the opportunity to recapture with your rook. And after the double exchange, we see that white is actually going to lose 2 minor pieces for a rook, and that's really good because we know that, I mean, it's good for black, not for white. We know that essentially the 2 minor pieces are much more important than a rook. First, because they're double force, and secondly, because 3 plus 3, you know, each minor piece is usually about 3 points, so 3 plus 3 is 6, and the rook is only 5 points, and we know that 2 minor pieces will prove stronger and more effective in the middle game. So ultimately, when you do castling, you solve that threat, and now you can actually prove this early attack that he started to be wrong. First, you can attack the knight, and a later stage, actually, you can even think about attacking the bishop. Like, if he does d3, you can do h6, and after a bit of a preparation, some development, you can immediately reach out for the white bishop and attack on it. Well, that's really good, and this is perfect. So that is the easiest way out to defend this. But remember from the first example the scholars made, when we were talking that there are 2 ways usually how we can meet such kind of an early attack by our opponent? The first is the solid. I mean, we need to know the basic pattern of how to defend. But sometimes, in particular occasions, we can go with a little more aggressive approach. And before he even goes and makes the attack, we can prove him wrong. Is there a way to do that if white tries to make knight g5 possible? Well, there absolutely is. Let's get back to the position. I mean, you've probably seen that type of approach in many of your games. When white plays knight c3 and he goes for knight g5. So, ultimately, what we have to do here is this just bishop c5 and defend passively. I mean, what if he doesn't play knight g5? We have sort of Italian, which is fine. And yet, there is a better way how you can handle it. And it's not just better. It's fantastic. The line to follow that through is knight takes c4. Now, this is how you prove the early bishop c4 to knight c3 ineffective. Now, what does white have as options? Well, one of his major options is definitely to take the knight. I mean, it's a free knight in the middle. Who wouldn't take it? The problem, though, is that now we sacrifice in order to force white's knight to get in the middle and therefore get on the fork. So now when we do a move like d5, should white's bishop retreat, we can capture his knight very quickly. And when the bishop takes back, we can even follow with bishop to d6. We can castle. And what did we do? What did we achieve from this whole exchange? Oh, we achieved something very important. We got a strong pawn in the center, while actually white has a bishop. It should be equal, right? I mean, the bishop is a more important piece, so it's fine. Not really. You see, the center is the most important area of the board in chess, and we know that the player who has more pieces on it should be better. Yes, but now black doesn't have more pieces, so what's the problem to white? The problem is mainly that when we put a piece in there, we must make sure that the opponent can attack it. That's why the best pieces in the center are the pawns, because he can't deal with them so easy. He can't exchange or attack them. If it's the bishop on e4 that we're talking about, black may have the ability to later, when he finishes the development, because we don't want to be really, we don't want to delay our development. When we finish with the development, we're going to have the opportunity to kick it, to hit it with f5, and ultimately what we have to lose this bishop. When that happens, we're going to be able to advance, we can have more space, more center control, and pretty much the same thing happens even if white tries to be more tricky and takes an f7 first. That combination seems a bit scary because he's going to make our king a little bit up, and it seems a bit dangerous. Yet, if you see the next move of black, which is d5, you'll realize that even if white has one check with its knight, that's nothing but just a check. While black's king will very quickly get back to safety. He has the perfect control in the center, the bishop pair, actually 2 bishops versus only 1 bishop and knight by white, so the bishop pair is strong. And, I mean, white's attack will be very easily reduced. I mean, we can just do h6, and next move, when the white knight moves away, we can take it and terribly destroy his pawn structure. So this is a very aggressive and effective way of proving your opponent wrong in his early idea to take advantage and attack you quickly. See, the most interesting thing, actually, is that when the move of bishop takes f7 happens, king takes f7 and d5, center control really keeps the flexibility and the power of your pieces while it restricts the opponent. So knight takes c4 proves the early diversion and idea with knight g5 simply wrong. So with this, I'd like to conclude that plan on how we have to think, deal, and what patterns we have to remember against any of the early diversions that white can make against the f7 pawn in the Italian and two knights defense. So you can remember this, and within the next lecture, I'm going to show how to deal with a little deeper attack on the f7 that was used by Paul Morphy and is known as very famous and popular amongst the beginner players. Thank you, and see you next time.